My name is Vita Gerritsen. After a bachelor in archaeology here in Amsterdam at the University of Amsterdam, I'm currently finishing a research master in archaeology. And I'm here on behalf of the Amsterdam Troy Project. And I think most of you already know about this initiative because I think most of you came to this lecture because of it. But I will give a tiny introduction so everyone knows what we're talking about. So the Amsterdam Troy Project is an Amsterdam-based initiative led by Gerjan van Wijgaarden, who's also present during this lecture. And ever since 2018, the summer of 2018, we've been working at Troy doing the archaeology of archaeology, which in practice means that we do research into the previous excavators and researchers who worked at Troy. So we do office research, we analyze everything that they published or they recorded, but we also excavate at the site normally. We actually would have been there tonight at this moment. Tomorrow would have been our last day of the 2020 campaign, but unfortunately, due to circumstances, we could not go to Troy this year. Hopefully next year we'll go again. So please keep following us, stick with us, because there will be more in the future. All right, I've included my email address as well in this first slide. Please save your questions until the end, but if you have any longer questions or want to know more about references or bibliography, just email me and I will get back to you soon with more answers. So this is what I'll be talking to you about tonight. First, I'm gonna give you a short introduction. Then we'll talk about Schliemann's background, his adolescence, his many occupations before he reached Troy. Then we're gonna discuss how Schliemann actually came to work at Troy and all the obstacles he found along the way. Then we'll talk about his actual excavations and accompanying publications, and a little bit about the reception of Schliemann, because that's a big subject for everyone involved. Then I'll take you along a little bit on the work I've been doing at Troy for the last 2 years. So the archaeology of Schliemann's archaeology. And then we'll hopefully circle back to this beginning and give some concluding remarks. So why is Heinrich Schliemann such an interesting man to study? Because I've been submerging myself for a couple of years now, and that's for many reasons. Of course, he was a remarkable and quite infamous man. I think a lot of you will agree, because so many people in this world have somewhat of an opinion regarding Schliemann and his work at Troy specifically. And he's faced many criticisms and hardships. And I hope to also provide you with a more positive note, because I feel like we should really place him in his time. And also, I don't think we can judge someone for not following the rules when there actually weren't that much rules yet. So I hope we can shine a light from different sides during this lecture, and well, let's not face everything at face value. Oftentimes you will hear people more or less mock Schliemann or what he did at Troy. You can hear people say, well, he bulldozed through the site and he lost so much valuable information because he just went straight through it. But after talking about also his background today and his motivations, I hope you can see the nuance in this as well. I think a lot of people also know Schliemann from, well, the spectacular finds and the spectacular things he did. Over here you see a picture of his wife, Sophia, wearing some of the gold of Priam's treasure. We'll talk more about that later. But those are the kind of spectacular things that people often remember him by, and there's so much more. So first a little bit about his background. He was born on the 6th of January in 1822 in Neubekov in Germany. And after a year, the family moved to Ankershagen. And in the house where they live, there's still, or right now there's the Heinrich Schliemann Museum. I haven't been there myself yet, but they have an amazing team who's really doing their best to get the truth about Schliemann on the table. Also really want to mention Wout Arendse in this aspect, because his efforts in presenting the truth about Schliemann are incomparable, and he taught me a lot. Schliemann came from a rather poor family. His father was a pastor, not a wealthy one. His mother unfortunately died when Schliemann was only 9 years old. This meant, in a practical sense, that Schliemann could not follow the education, the proper education or the higher education that he really wanted to follow, because he was a very bright kid, knack for languages. Was very well at writing at an early age. Um, so that was very difficult that he could not pursue an academic career, and this would follow him for the rest of his life, definitely. But at the young age of 14, he started working at a grocer's, where he learned a little bit about business and trade, which would also come in handy later. And afterwards, he got employment as a ship hand on a ship called the Dorothea. But the Dorothea was bound for Venezuela from Hamburg, but they got shipwrecked here off the Dutch coast. Fortunately, they all survived, but Schliemann found his way to Amsterdam. And he had a great time here. He worked here for 4 years in different occupations. Over here on the PowerPoint, we see a picture of a building here in Amsterdam that's falsely been named the House of Heinrich Schliemann. It was actually one of the offices where he worked, but still, it's right here in Amsterdam. There's still many traces of him. Afterwards, he moved to St. Petersburg, also for a trading company. He worked there. And then he went on a stint to California, where he got into the gold dust trade. And that's where he started to make his small fortune. He did really well for himself. It was the right time. Gold dust is always, well, can make you a small fortune, apparently. Afterwards, he went back to Russia, where he got into the indigo trade first, then became a military contractor during the Crimean Wars. And this made him so much money that he could retire at the age of 38, more or less. This meant that at that early age, he could really pursue his dream. And his dream was, he said himself, ever since he was a little boy, to discover the locations written by his favorite author, Homer. He wanted to prove that Homeric Troy, for example, was a real place. That was his dream in life. So, okay, we have a man talking the 1860s, in his 40s, with a huge fortune, with an enormous interest in archaeology and in discovering archaeological sites. So how did he get from that point to actually working at the site that we now know as Troy? Well, that's all because of a man named Frank Calvert, who came from a consul family in the area of the Mount Hisarlik, where Troy is located. And Calvert was already convinced that Homeric Troy was to be found there at Mount Hisarlik. Unfortunately, Calvert's efforts to get a project started did not really work out. But then he met Schliemann, a man who was also determined to find Troy and who had all the funds and contacts and was very happy to work with Calvert there on the site. The thing was that Calvert had already bought half of the land of the site of the Mount of Hisarlik. Schliemann asked him to also buy the other half on his behalf and to get a permit from the Ottoman authorities to actually excavate there. This all took some time. Schliemann was very impatient and he started an illegal excavation on the site, on the half of the site that was not owned by Frank Calvert. So he excavated there illegally in 1870. Of course, this did not help to get the permit needed for the excavation, so the delay was increased even more. And it wasn't until 1871, October, that Schliemann actually received the permit to start working at Troy. That's where we get to his excavations. So the season from 1871 till 1873 is considered by himself as his first campaign. So he's omitting the illegal season he already dug there in 1870. And as he's handling that standard, I think we should do it as well in this presentation. So I'm going to talk you through all of these excavation seasons and tell you about the remarkable finds and what was special about these excavations. So the first campaign, 71 till 73, well, as some of you can already tell probably by the pictures on this PowerPoint, the end of this campaign was very special, and we'll get through this. First things first, in 71, he started with a rather small team, and they only worked for 1.5 months. He had 20 workmen, so you would maybe say, well, maybe not that much of work could be done in that short amount of time, but they actually excavated, amongst other things, a trench of 60 meters long, 10 meters wide, and 10 meters deep. So that's 6,000 cubic meters that they already did in 1.5 months. Well, of course, Schliemann was no expert. He was no archaeologist at this point. He was trying everything out. He was trying his methods. And even then, especially actually in those early seasons, it was not that much of the bulldozering that we often ascribe to Schliemann, because he was actually digging in horizontal layers. He was making sure that he was seeing what he was doing. And even though, of course, they removed a lot of soil, and it was not done in the scientific way that we would like to see today, he was working horizontally. He didn't go straight down, even though at first that might have been what he wanted to do. But as soon as he got to work, he realized that he could see way more of the site when he was working horizontally. So, well, okay, they removed a lot of soil. It was a good season to start with. In 1872, they got into a real big scale excavation, and they started working at multiple places at once, which also meant that Schliemann couldn't oversee everything himself. They were working with a huge team by this time, a lot of local workmen, and they dug all over the site, very big trenches, removed a lot of soil. And of course, when you see the results of this, you can imagine why people talk about bulldozering the site or have criticism on him. But still, they also did a lot of work, and they were learning along the way. A nice example, I think, of how Schliemann was figuring it all out is that at a certain point, 2 of his workmen got buried because 2 of the trench walls collapsed on them. Fortunately, they both survived. But from that moment onwards, Schliemann realized that he had to slope his trench walls so that there was less of a risk of collapse. And I think just a tiny example, but it shows that he's really trying to learn and trying to get the real archaeological excavation thing. Then we get to 1873. It was already quite a long season, but it was cut off abruptly on the 14th of June, and that's because a very special find was done. And of course, I'm talking about Priam's treasure, falsely named so because it could not have belonged to Priam, as it turned out later. It was a millennium too early. But this treasure is very disputed still today, because this is an interesting story, and according to Schliemann's official reports, it was found on the 7th of June, but we know that on the 6th of June, he smuggled it out of the Ottoman Empire illegally to Greece. So that official account is not true. Anyway, the nature of this treasure is disputed anyway, because still a lot of people also believe that bought the artifact somewhere else and placed them there deliberately. I think we might never know, as there's so much dispute about this treasure anyway, and I think there's more that we don't know about the treasure than that we do know. What we do know is that he smuggled the treasure to Greece. Then he promised the treasure to Greece. But then he sent the treasure to Berlin in 81, where it was on display until shortly before the Second World War, when they hid it in a place called the Zoo Tower for safekeeping. Then after the war, somebody realized that the treasure was not in the Zoo Tower anymore. And nobody knew what happened, and people just figured that it might have gotten lost or destroyed or looted or something in that chaos that happened at the end of the Second World War. And it wasn't until 1996 that the Pushkin Museum revealed that the Red Army had actually taken the treasure from Berlin in 1945, and that they were going to exhibit it, and they were not planning to give it back to whichever country put a claim to it. So especially in these times when there's a lot of discussion about, well, looted art and who owns what, who owns the past, I think this won't be the last time that we hear about this treasure. But of course, here I put another picture of Sophia with the treasure just because it's such a speaking image, I think, also of how he handled the treasure. So he took the treasure to Greece and then photographed his wife with the treasure in Greece. Of course, this did not sit well with Ottoman authorities because he had smuggled the treasure out and they actually had a proper claim to half of the treasure. And it would take a lot of years, and Schliemann actually had to give half of the treasure to the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul, where you can still visit that part of the treasure. But yeah, it would take many years before Schliemann was allowed to work on the site again, which I think is, well, justifiable. Uh, so back in 1878, he went back to working on the site. By this time, he had already published his Trojanischer Altertümer book, and in there he was still very certain that he had already found the first parts of the Homeric Troy layer. He had found some burned houses. In this season, he was still pretty convinced, but he also found a lot of like burned, scrabbly huts, and he started to doubt a little bit, like, could this really be Homeric Troy? Is this the wealthy city that was besieged by the Greek? So he was not sure anymore. So that's what he was trying to figure out as well during this season. He brought along some backup, among which the very famous physician Virchow, Rudolf Virchow, who was also the discoverer of leukemia, for example. But at the time, he was very interested in anthropology and ethnology, amongst other things. So he accompanied Schliemann. Then in 82, he already really started to doubt whether those burned huts were really the Troy he was looking for. And he started to think that maybe he went a little too deep. And this season, he also brought along Wilhelm Dürpfeld. Dürpfeld would become his successor a couple of years later. And Dürpfeld, apart from being a brilliant archaeologist who had already worked at Olympia, was also an architect. And he really helped Schliemann in discovering how the walls interacted with each other, how the different phases of city at Troy interacted with each other, and how they were all connected or disconnected. And so Dürpfeld was really, really, I mean, he did so much for the work of Schliemann that we definitely needed to mention him. Then Schliemann's last season, 1888 till 1890. At this time, he left most of the day-to-day work to Dürpfeld, as he was already very involved with all the politics and diplomatic things that came along with being director of such a site. So he was often touring people around and trying to convince international scholars, of which he so desperately wanted to be a part, and he wanted to be taken seriously. And I think in this phase of his life, he was quite accomplished at that, especially after finding the treasure and publishing his works about it. Many people really started to respect him and see him as an intellectual, as a scholar, which is everything he ever wanted, apart from finding Troy, which he had also done at this point. So that's really amazing. In 1890, he got a really bad ear infection. He traveled all over Europe trying to find a cure. And when that didn't work out, he decided to go back to his wife, Sophia, in Athens. But while he was waiting for the ferry in Naples, he collapsed in the square there. And the next day, unfortunately, he passed. And on the right at the PowerPoint, you can see his tomb actually in Athens in the first cemetery. It's a very monumental tomb, so it's very fitting for this man. But he died at the age of 68, so he could never finish he wasn't able to finish his life work at Troy. So I already slightly brushed on this, but what did other people think of Schliemann? Because he didn't get the formal education that he had wanted to have, and he really wanted to be taken seriously by his peers, by the general public. He wanted to be considered a scholar and an intellectual. And he wasn't autodidactic. He taught himself everything, and he learned along the way. And I think in that part, we really don't give him enough credit because he did everything himself and he surrounded himself with people who knew a lot about the things that he wanted to know about. So, a very nice example of a self made man in that way. Well, it would take 40 years before the first biography on Schliemann was published in commission by his wife. This was written by Emil Ludwig. And this was a very positive account. And aside from that, we only had Schliemann's own publications. So the image he created of himself. So up until that point, it was all positive. Then Ernst Mayr published some of his correspondence, and this was strongly redacted, and parts were left out because Mayr wanted to create an image of Schliemann as the perfect German because of the time it was published in 1936. And it wasn't until much later, until 1972, that the first scholars started to question, well, have we ever really checked if everything that Schliemann said was correct? And then we had William Calder, who found out that a lot of the personal accounts by Schliemann wasn't even about his excavations, but that a lot of his personal accounts were false. This was mostly about places he went or people he met, and which he wrote about in his diaries and his notebooks, his publications, and a lot of them turned out to be simply untrue. After that, some other scholars started to dive deeper into his work at Troy, and also they found some inconsistencies. But I think also if you take the time span into account, there will always be some inconsistencies. Of course, some things were, I don't know, overreacted in a way, but it's tough to say that when you find some inconsistencies that per definition everything is untrue, and I don't think we should believe that. And for example, all the things I told you about his youth just now, those accounts are all verifiable. So there were a couple of books published that really put a dagger into his back in some way, and after that he was outlawed more or less by the academic community, and people just didn't believe his accounts anymore. Fortunately, I think the last couple of years, maybe a couple of decades, people are softening up a little bit and also understand that he did a lot for archaeology. He was the first one to really excavate at such a large scale, and he put so much money and time into finding Troy that in that way we also owe a lot to Schliemann in terms of the discipline of archaeology. So I think it's good that we see both sides of the story nowadays. Right, then back to the reason why I am giving you this lecture today. That's because I've been researching and excavating Schliemann's trenches, well, Schliemann's work at Troy for the last couple of years. And of course, I want to mention, as you can see on this slide, that of course I did not do so alone because I always had an amazing team around me and with me, and amazing workmen who really supported us and without whom we could have never done as much work as we did now. So yeah, big thanks to those people, definitely. And now I will take you through the 2018 and 2019 campaigns and what I did then. All right, on the 2018 campaign, I excavated a place that we would lovingly come to call the bump. That's because of its shape, as you can see on the picture in the PowerPoint. It was a small bump of soil on top of two wall structures. And the reason we wanted to excavate here was because on some of the maps by Dirkveld, he drew in that they had also excavated the wall underneath this bump of soil. So we thought, well, what's on top of it then must be dump from that period. And dumps are very interesting for us because it enables us to retrieve the steps of the excavators. And Schliemann had also written quite extensively about his work in this part, but not in this particular spot. So we started excavating, and then soon afterwards, really soon afterwards, right underneath the surface, we found some pretty intact mud bricks. And I could talk for hours on mud brick, but I'm not going to do that this time. Mud bricks are sun-dried bricks that you use usually on the superstructure of a wall. All right, so when we encountered this, there was a slight bit of panic because you're not supposed to find something like this in a dump. So I went back to the office and into the notebooks, and then I soon realized that there were more walls that Dürpfeld had drawn on his maps that were not actually excavated. When he would see two pieces of wall, he would estimate where the corner would be, and he would draw in the corner, for example, even though that corner would not have been excavated. Of course, this is just filling in the blanks, and it's pretty logical, but I didn't know that at the time at first. So that might have been what happened here. Also, another hint towards what might be going on here I found in the books by Donald Easton, who's written extensively on Schliemann as well. I'm really grateful to him. And he wrote that Schliemann had tiny ramps all along the side because he dug to enormous depth. He had to take the soil out as well. And when you have very deep trenches, it's difficult to get the soil out. So he left small ramps on which he could carry carts and baskets with the soil onto the dumps on the north side of the site. So this might have been one of his tiny ramps because it was just impossible that this type of mud brick, you can maybe see it even better in this picture, would be in a dump. All right, this meant that we were actually excavating an untouched, or as we call it, in situ part of the site. That's not part of our project, so we stopped immediately. There are some interesting conclusions to this mud brick find because the soil on top of it, it was only 15 centimeters max, and it was very loose. And my working hypothesis, at least, is that this was accumulation of the 150 years that Schliemann did not work there anymore, and that it was not that Schliemann must have seen this mud brick in place. So this is when our suspicion started to arise that Schliemann did not really care that much about mud brick, to say it harshly, or he must have seen it and he must not deemed it important, because we have written records where he recognizes it, so he knows what it is, what mud brick is. Interesting, but something to keep in mind for the next year. That we were digging in situ place also gave me the opportunity to scout for a good location to excavate the next year. So here we see a picture of Gerjan and myself climbing the steep hills on the north slopes to find a location for my 2019 trench. In 2019, I got to work on one of the big dumps of Schliemann on the north side. He was used, especially during the early days of his career, to, well, the site is on a hill, on a mount, or a tell, and he would simply flip or dump his dump soil over the edge on the north side. So the hill actually got wider because of all the dumps by Schliemann. So I made a small step trench, as we are used to doing with hillsides, for example, because as you might imagine, when everything is dumped off a hillside, it will not be perfect stratigraphical horizontal layers on top of each other. So I made a step trench. On the first photo, you can see my shadow as I'm photographing my trench in the bright sun, which is never a good idea, but I thought it was a nice photo to put yourself in my place, so to say. I worked there for over 3 weeks, And at first we found a lot of interesting things. At first I encountered a lot of big stones and also architectural blocks, which you can see in the second photo, for example. And this really fit in nicely with Schliemann's own description of his work in the area, because he writes about how he encountered quite some small buildings and walls that he did not deem important, or that were definitely on top of the burnt layer he was looking for. So he removed those. And well, here's the physical evidence of what he writes in his notebook. So that's one of the things we really like about the Amsterdam Troy project, that we're able to physically check something that has been written down 150 years ago. So a lot of rocks, a lot of stones. As I went deeper, I again encountered a lot of mud brick. And in this case, well, we already thought that he didn't deem mud brick that important. But now I also found burned mud brick. And that's interesting because Schliemann was looking specifically for burnt materials, burnt building materials. But he might not have recognized these mud bricks to be burnt. So that's another interesting thing to keep in mind, because maybe he just didn't know. He didn't know what burnt mud brick looked like, or again, he visualized important buildings as being made out of stone. And I mean, that tendency has been going on for decades, that monumental buildings were stones, not mud bricks, not clay bricks that have been dried in the sun. So that's interesting as well. The most interesting part, though, although I do want to pull your attention to the fourth photo here, because this was my view from my trench last year, so that you can also see how amazing it is to work at Troy. But the most interesting find I did last year was that I found a whole lot, an enormous amount of metal slag. And for those of you who don't know, metal slag is a leftover product, and so also an indicator of metal production. Yeah, and the thing with slag is that it comes in all shapes, colors, sizes, depending on the composition of the metal that was being produced. But it often quite looks like a rock, a small rock, big rock sometimes. Can be porous, that's how I recognize it quite often, but sometimes there's hardly any of the characteristic bubbles inside. It's pretty hard to recognize. I was lucky that I had been working with metal slag in Greece quite often, so I knew how to recognize it. And then I started finding entire caches of these metal slags in Schliemann's dump. Okay, you might say this is not as important as I may make it sound, but there's more to this story, because at a certain point, I already told you that Schliemann really started doubting whether he had gone too far. And when he was in some of the Bronze Age layers, he actually started thinking that he had reached Stone Age layers, which was way before Homeric Troy, of course. So he was really, well, a bit frustrated about this. But why he thought he was hitting Stone Age layers was because he didn't find any traces of metal production, or so he said, or so he thought. Because in the end, there were traces of metal production, but at the time, I think they didn't have the means to recognize this. They might have been looking for bigger traces of metal production, but the slags were right here. So, well, you can imagine how psyched I was when we found this out. It was again with the help of Wout Arendsen, who knows everything. So that was a really nice discovery for all of us, because it really showed how what we're doing with the Amsterdam Troy Project can actually bring us new information and can put everything, all the thorough research to perspective in a certain way, because you can really retrace someone's steps and try to reimagine what they were thinking, what decisions they made, and well, that's just wonderful, I think. So very pleased with that. And then, well, now we've heard all about Schliemann's life, his background, his work. I hope I have convinced you guys that it's not that black and white, although, well, now I have a PowerPoint picture that's very black and white. For some concluding remarks, well, I just really want to say that I hope that Heinrich Schliemann will not be one of those people that will, I don't know, fall into the realm of being forgotten or being ostracized because he worked there 150 years ago doing what he thought was best because he was driven by his dream to uncover Homeric Troy. So that was mostly my aim during this lecture, to take you through his life and to shine some light on both the negative aspects and the positive aspects, because I really hope we can all find the nuance back and also recognize everything that he has done for archaeology, even though he was a bit of a gold seeker and he was, well, quite a brute sometimes in his excavations, but those were different times. It's difficult. I hope you can at least reconsider how you felt about him beforehand.